welcome to the program, Angela Davis. Nice to see you. How are you? Thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, absolutely.
How's things?
It's a pleasure. Everything is going quite well.
Nice. I mean, you keep busy, clearly at this point, talking, and there's a variety of issues that you're dealing with, so there's a lot of ground we can cover. I want to start right off with the idea of the justice system in America right now, because you know it all too well.
Yeah.
How it could play out.
Well, you know, I never realized when I was younger that I would spend the majority of my life doing work around prison issues, one way or another. And then I realized that actually my mother had been involved in a very important case, the Scottsboro 9, in the 1930s. So somehow she must have passed that on to me.
When did you realize that? How long into your journey?
Well, I've been doing work explicitly around political prisoners and prison issues since the 1960s. I would say the early 60s.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
It's a long time. I think for a lot of people, when they hear the phrase, those who want to abolish prisons, I don't think they may not have the same understanding of the issues that perhaps you would in the way you present it. So your position on it is what?
Well, yes, I am. I identify as a prison abolitionist. And those of us who are a part of what we call the 21st century abolition movement want to see the issues that prisons attempt to address but cannot. We want to see those issues dealt with differently and more effectively. I mean, for example, violence against women. If we simply incarcerate every man or woman who commits an act of violence against women, that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem goes away. What it means is we have ever more people behind bars. So I want us to figure out how to resolve these pressing social problems. How do we create an educational system in the U.S.? The educational system, the public educational system, is a shambles. Mm-hmm. And if you go into any prison in the States, you'll discover that the vast majority of the prisoners are illiterate. They never had an opportunity, not only to learn how to read and write, but to imagine the future, to get a sense of what it means to learn and acquire knowledge and think about oneself in the future.
And it's also about giving everybody a fair shake. Like everybody has the same chance, at the very least, to try to make something of themselves.
Absolutely.
Or build a life they want. Addressing the root causes is something that people know about, politicians know about, state leaders know about, business leaders know about, but it doesn't seem to be really dealt with in a big way. The education system, as you said, is in shambles, but it didn't used to be this bad, did it?
No, actually it didn't.
It's getting worse. How is that happening?
It's much worse. I teach in the university system in the University of California. California used to have the best public education system in the country. People immigrated from the East Coast to California because they knew they could get literally a free education from kindergarten to postgraduate level. Mm-hmm. And now in the state of California, more money is spent on prisons than on education.
Is that because they're businesses and they're privately run, and the people that run the prisons are in the interest of building their business?
Well, see, this is another reason why abolition is so important, because incarceration, imprisonment has become a profitable phenomenon. There are so many corporations involved in the business of incarcerating that they have stakes in the continuation of this gigantic system, regardless of whether it assists the people who are there, regardless of whether it punishes the people who are there.
I think it's partly that it's the will of the people, in a sense, that we live in a punishment society. People want their pound of flesh. And oftentimes, they're not worried about recidivism. They're not worried about rehabilitation. It's that particular individual who's convicted of a crime needs to pay their debt to society. And we're conditioned to hear about their debt to society. And so you have a culture of people that are interested in seeing the bad person go to jail. And doesn't that also feed into the problem?
most people, including myself, I have to catch myself sometimes, when someone does something bad to me, the first instinct is to figure out how to get back at that person. Right. So, how do we imagine justice in a very different context? Justice that's not based on vengeance, but justice that's made on repairing the relationships that are damaged through harm.
It's a long-term plan, obviously.
Very long-term plan. Very long-term plan.
And you think about it, it wasn't that long ago when, segregation was a reality. And it wasn't that long ago when a student gets killed because he integrates a school. This is in most people who are watching their lifetime. Do you look at this like 20, 40, 50, 60 years? Is this a century long of constantly changing attitudes?
Well, I do, and actually I would go back to the era of slavery, because the civil rights era, the mid-20th century, was an attempt to address problems that stemmed from slavery. In a sense, it was the second abolition movement, the first one being the abolitionist movement against slavery. So I do think we have to imagine these, prospects along a continuum that goes for decades. I often point out that when I was young, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, and I used to sometimes get very upset that as a black child, I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I couldn't go to the amusement park. I couldn't go to the big library. We had to go to this sort of rundown black library. Mm-hmm. And, my mother was always very careful to tell me that this is not the way things were supposed to be. She said, this is not the way things are supposed to be, and they will change. So she allowed me to develop the capacity to imagine the future in a way that sometimes seems very radical. But it seemed radical during the era of slavery. And so today, of course, slavery, even though we think we've abolished it, we haven't. But still, in terms of the way people think about it, it's seen as horrendous, atrocious.
But even though in the civil rights movement there was a hard target, right? There was you're ending segregation in a lot of places, so people could see a beginning and a middle and an end to that story. You get to today, and even though there is a black president, you go to lots of parts of the United States of America, there's segregation. Like it's a little bit more behind the scenes, and in a sense, it feels like the movement has changed and doesn't exist anymore. That the moment there was integration, people said, "Well, we've done it."
Well, and that's problematic. Actually, during that era, in the 50s, in the 60s, I remember very clearly, the movement was seen as a freedom movement. Although it came to be interpreted as very narrowly as a campaign against legal segregation, it was much broader. It included economic dimensions. I not only want to be able to have the right to sit in this restaurant and eat, but I need a job to make the money that will allow me to enter the restaurant. So those are the kinds of issues people talked about in those days. Unfortunately, we came to see it as simply an assault against segregation and as simply an effort to integrate into a society that was already flawed. But Dr. King, who of course is perhaps the most one of the most well-known public figures. He's the only non-president in the States to have a holiday. He's the only person of color to have a national holiday. He pointed out that it made no sense to integrate into a society without at the same time criticizing the structure of that society.
Is it part of it the way the movement's changed and the way protests have changed? Because I mean, I wasn't born in that era, but I've listened to the stuff that Dick Gregory did. I know I look 60. I know I'm 59. No,
okay.
But the era, like, there's no Dick Gregory anymore. Like, comedians who went out there who were more than just comedians. There was a completely different. It's as if people go to protests right now. They have their protests, and then they go home. And then aside from the grassroots people still organizing, the the mass of the population who protest go home and think they've done their job. Whereas back then with Black Panthers and with, even to a degree the Nation of Islam, there was a movement that sustained itself, and that seems to be missing.
When I was much younger, and not in my 60s, we imagined ourselves as a part of vast communities. And you didn't even have to know the person with whom you shared community. People in Vietnam who were struggling for their freedom were a part of our community, and we imagined ourselves in that way. So therefore, it wasn't simply about just going out to a demonstration. The demonstration demonstrated the existence of that movement. And today, we tend to see the demonstration as the movement, and that's really problematic.
You talk to the students. Do they, when you're with them, what is their response to you when you say that?
Well, I have a lot of hope and a lot of faith in young people.
But do you have hope based on faith, or do you have hope based on data? Because hope and faith, we saw a president campaign on hope, and we see what reality is, right? So where does your hope come from?
Okay, I think you need the hope, but you need the analysis as well, and you also need to recognize the extent to which people, when they come together, can bring about change. The Obama campaign was a perfect example of that. Now, the problem is, it seems that they thought that all they had to do was to get him elected, and then they could go home and enjoy the fruits of their candidate.
It's like he won, and all these doves were released into the air, and the world was a better place.
Yeah, well, and it's like, okay, we've done our job. We put you in the White House. Now you do yours. Yeah. But he's the president of the United States, and those of us who were involved in that campaign, because I participated, I have to say, this is the first campaign that I participated in not supporting a candidate who was, I guess I should come right out and say either a communist or Peace and Freedom Party.
Yeah, I mean, you ran as a communist, right?
I ran as a communist.
Yeah. And Obama's not a communist.
Obama is definitely not a communist.
We had somebody who you may know, we had Andrew Young on the show, and he endorsed Hillary, not Obama. And I wondered if you felt, not that life is so simple, that it's I'm black, so I'll vote for a black candidate, or I'm a woman, so I'll vote for a female. But did you have to think about the impact that both of those, your decision would have on both of them?
No, I actually supported Obama because of the issues. And I know that within the Democratic Party, black Democrats, by and large, in the beginning, gravitated towards Hillary. And later, as a result of this campaign, they changed their position. Now, I supported Obama because of the politics he represented at the time. And many of us assumed that by now, the prison at Guantanamo Bay would be shut down.
Do you feel let down?
Well, I have no illusions about his capabilities as an individual. I am upset because I think we have also failed. Had we kept that movement together, and had we put the kind of pressure on the President of the United States, regardless of who he or she happens to be, then I think we might be in a better situation. We might not have such a massive war in Afghanistan.
I mean, you were facing some serious charges, you're talking about those gun-related charges, and you could have faced a very different life had you been convicted. You had an all-white jury, and you were acquitted. Was that 1972?
Yes.
When you were acquitted? You know that moment just before they announced the verdict? What was going through your head in that moment?
Well, I was very nervous because I should point out I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, and initially all three of them were capital crimes. Yeah. But at the same time, I knew that I was not standing there alone. I was not sitting there alone. There were people who became involved in the campaign all over the country, here in Canada, huge numbers of people in Canada and in Europe and in Africa and in South America and in Asia. So I didn't feel alone. I felt that whatever the outcome, I would have this enormous international support system.
The Stones had a song about you, and John and Yoko wrote a song. Hurricane Carter was on the show and said that when Dylan wrote the song about him, it meant an enormous amount to him. How did you feel when that happened?
Well, it made me feel a little humble, I guess, because I remember thinking, why do I deserve all of this? I'm just one person involved in a movement that encompasses vast numbers of people. What about all of the other people who are in prison? Why do I, as an individual, deserve this? But of course, I totally appreciate it.
Especially as a communist.
Yeah,
Here's it again.
exactly.
This is about us, not me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In my limited time going to different parts of Africa, trying to tell stories there and interviewing people who've been dealing with poverty and rights in Africa, everybody points to one thing, says it's a women's issue, that if you create a better reality for women there in equality, that a lot of the problems in the various places in Africa will change. When you look at America and the things that are going through, is it the same issue in some respects?
Well, in many respects it is, and I think it's that oftentimes people have such a narrow view of feminism that they assume it is women versus men, but it's not. It's about equality. It's about justice. Justice for women will mean justice for men and women. And of course, now we have transgender issues that have developed. I think that what's exciting about the way in which social movements develop is that we become aware of new issues. As we move forward, we become aware of the interconnections between the struggle against racism, the struggle against homophobia, the struggle to save the environment, environmental justice, animal rights, etc. So Martin Luther King said justice is indivisible, and I think that's the most important message.
Right. Last question I have, because I know you have to go. You and Condoleezza Rice are not from too far apart from each other. Do you look at the story and go, how did the two of us end up where we did in completely different realities?
Well, I'm reading a biography of her right now, and I'm amazed that so many of the same experiences, although she's a bit younger than I am. But what I think I would say is that civil rights are not enough. The trajectory that she moves along from the segregated conditions in Birmingham, Alabama, into the two Bush administrations is one that has a certain logic to it. But the logic is that of civil rights and not necessarily of justice, not necessarily
in the
of
Oval
equality.
Office. It's what you do in the Oval Office.
Yeah, and you see, I think the difference is that I've always been aware of the fact that I'm a part of a larger community, and I don't want to go anywhere unless I can take everybody else with me. Whereas she wants to go where she, as an individual, is able to go.
It's good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Thank you. Angela Davis, everybody. We'll be right back.